In this episode, we're going to be speaking on The Dark Tower, a huge fantasy series by Stephen King. Probably one of the best book series I've ever read. It's not up there with Watchmen, it's not at that huge, super elite level, but it is still a very great story. And ironically, the build up to the story is much better than its ending. So, you do want to read all the books because it gives you a huge impact at the end, but I will say that the starting books are a lot stronger. And I'm going to start off in a weird way because the first book, in terms of the story, again, if you just want to get to the story, really only want to read The Drawing of the Three and move from books 2 to 7. The first one is a really nice book. It's very lyrical, it's very short, it's very modernist. It just provides you with a lot of critical information, but I need to be honest that you don't really need to read it in order to understand the story. In terms of the plot, you can more or less gather enough information from books 2 to 7 to understand what is going on with the story, so you don't need to read it. And I've just encountered a lot of people who are very resistant to it. It's a very confusing book. It's, again, has a lot of good passages, some interesting scenes, especially the final scene between Walter and the gunslinger is very powerful. But ironically, you really only need to read it after you read the last seventh book, and I can't say why at this point. This is a non-spoiler review, but you'll understand what I'm saying. That the first book is always more been a preface to the real story. So now, what happens in Drawing of the Three? Well, essentially, the gunslinger has a prophetic meeting with Walter at the end of the first book, and Walter sets him off on the real quest. He says you have to gather these companions if you wish to save the tower. And the tower is sort of a nexus point that is upholding all these alternate realities, including the reality of Roland. So essentially, they're trying to save reality because the gunslinger is not from our reality, he's from his reality. So he has to essentially do both time travel and leap through dimensions to gather allies to save the tower. And the second book is devoted to this gathering of allies and essentially raising a small army to help him out. Now, I don't want to overpromise. The second book really is just devoted just to that. It's just devoted to gathering these two really wild personalities and how he's going to deal with them because they're very unstable for various reasons. They have psychological problems, they have mental problems, they have financial problems, they have a ton of problems. But again, as Walter says, you need these specific people. You cannot move on without the quest unless you have these people, and you cannot get out of that because a major theme he's going to bring up is destiny within all these books. And for King, destiny is what he calls a ka, and the group is called a quartet. So, good side, bad side. Well, on the good side, it's very well done in terms of the second book. There's a lot of great action. It's very well paced. The prose style is very, very powerful. But the second part is, and you're going to already see it in the second book, there's a ton of plot contradictions. There's a lot of discontinuities. It's not completely consistent in terms of its own myth making. So the myth is, I think, really well done. It's very spectacular, but it's not completely consistent. So if you do want a book that has a very straightforward plot and is wholly consistent, then this book series is not for you. He's going to take a lot of wild swerves. In fact, Stephen King himself becomes a character in the story in a very weird way, but it actually does make sense. But you're going to have to sacrifice a lot in terms of plot continuity in order to enjoy the whole series in terms of its larger story. So the narrative as a whole is very well done. It's very powerful. I really do like the characters, especially the ones that are going to come in with the third book, The Wastelands. I think The Wastelands is probably the best book of the whole series. In fact, it's one of the best books I've ever read, period. It's really a great book in terms of prose style. But the second book is also very decent. And for its size and price, I think it's very reasonable. It's only, within a certain range. It's actually something that you can read pretty quickly. And The Gunslinger is even shorter than that. But in terms of the story, it's a very critical part because it really shows you what the gunslinger is willing to do and what he's willing not to do in order to save the tower. So the second book is very highly recommended. It's a very powerful beginning to this much larger, I think very incredible fantasy series. And if you're a fan of The Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of Lord of the Rings references. And as he admits, King used Lord of the Rings as kind of a structure to model the Dark Tower on. Alright, so this has been a non-spoiler review of The Drawing of the Three and the Dark Tower series. This has been Fantasy Analyzed. If you like the content, please hit the like button and or subscribe. Thank you for listening. Please be safe.